Tonight, we are very excited to have an international panel of experts who are zooming in from around the world in all kinds of different time zones. And I will introduce them in alphabetical order. So first, and the way tonight is going to go, just so you know, is we're going to have a kind of discussion for about 1 hour on issues related to Indigenous land claims, law, and rights. And then we're going to open the conversation to field some of your questions. This is the Zoom webinar format, which means that you can pose questions in chat, but you can't speak or raise your hand as you would in a normal Zoom session. So we will be keeping our eye on the chat box. Feel free to make comments, pose questions. We have a lot to talk about, and should we not answer all of your questions tonight, we will definitely be here next Wednesday at 12:30, and we'll be happy to field those questions. I see people in the chat box are now debating the question of who is the GOAT, but I'm not going to field those questions right now. I am instead going to introduce our illustrious speakers, and I am so excited to have this panel tonight. So we have tonight Professor Doug Kiel, who is an assistant professor of history, hello, at Northwestern University in Chicago, where he teaches Native American history with particular interest in the Great Lakes regions and federal Indian law and policy. He is currently finishing a book entitled Unsettling Territory, Oneida Indian Resurgence and Anti-Sovereignty Backlash. Doug also serves as an adjunct curator at the Field Museum in Chicago, where he's part of a team developing a new permanent exhibition on Native North America. And he's also served as an expert witness in regards to Indigenous land rights. Then we have, I don't know if everybody sees the same box as I have. To the lower left, we have Professor John Maynard, who is a Warami Aboriginal man from the Port Stephens region of New South Wales, Australia. He's currently chair of, Aboriginal, he is currently chair of Aboriginal history at the University of Newcastle. He's held several major positions and served on numerous prominent organizations and committees, including serving as the deputy chairperson of the Australia Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. He was on the executive committee of the Australian Historical Association and the New South Wales History Council. He has worked both with and within many Aboriginal communities, urban, rural, and remote, over several decades. His publications have concentrated on the intersections of Aboriginal political and social history and the history of Australian race relations. He's the author of a dozen books, including The Aboriginal Soccer Tribe, Aborigines and the Sport of Kings, and Fight for Liberty and Freedom. And last but not least, we have Mr. Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, who is at midnight joining us from South Africa, where he is a human rights lawyer and a legal historian, an author of a book which I am really looking forward to reading, published in 2018, called The Land is Ours. He also serves as an adjunct professor of public law at the University of Cape Town. So welcome to all of you. We are absolutely delighted. So we are going to, as I mentioned before, have kind of a roundtable discussion lasting for about 1 hour. Feel free to post comments in the chat. We're going to kind of see how this goes. This is our first time using this particular format, so we'll be curious to hear what you think about it. So I'm going to start off with just kind of an easygoing introductory question. And I'm just curious if each of you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your background, your training, and how you came to do this particular line of work. So Doug, how about we start with you?
Sure. Thank you for the introductions, and thank you for the invitation to join this conversation. I'm really excited to spend the next hour and a half conversing and learning. In terms of my own background and how I came into the work that I do, I began, I became interested in Indigenous studies as an undergraduate. And I wasn't initially interested in history, and I was really debating between a future in graduate school between history or law. And in many ways, I never made up my mind, but I went down the history path. And an ethic that I had in my work, I'm a first-gen college graduate, and was the beneficiary of resources from my Indigenous nation, the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, that offered me the opportunity to attend college, and my brothers as well, which was a transformative experience. And so, thinking about the ethics of the LePage Center, right, history and the public interest, I very much walked into the process of a dissertation thinking about that, right, that my nation has funded me to go to graduate school and get this history PhD. So I have to, do something politically useful with this important opportunity, right? Somehow figure out, a way. And that drove, my work and continues to drive my work. And I really began to respond to the political circumstances that were happening around me, which were processes of dramatic land recovery and buyback, but then also dramatic backlash and legal contestation, trying to slow down that process, right? Trying to effectively slow down the process of nation rebuilding. And so the work that I do broadly is about Indigenous nation rebuilding in the United States, really from the end of allotment at the end of the 19th century, which broke up tribal lands in the US, reaching into the present. And I think it was very easy to have a sense of Indigenous history and this rebuilding that's happening in the U.S. as something that is, driven largely or even exclusively by, in some narratives, casino gaming. And I wanted to narrate a much deeper history that begins in the aftermath of allotment and in conversations in which the community is beginning to ask, how on earth do we move forward from this? And in what sort of legal and political framework, and dealing with those conversations throughout and along the way. And effectively, what I study is the consequences of what happens when we're successful. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, sure. Well, I certainly come into this position. It's been a long journey, a roundabout way. I mean, I come through a school system in Australia of the 1950s and 1960s when we as Aboriginal people were not even in the history of this continent, except as Stone Age relics or a dying race. I mean, there was nothing for me to connect with in that school system or gain any inspiration from. Consequently, I switched off school from the very moment I walked through the gate until I left at the age of 15, which was the first age you could leave. And I said, I don't look back fondly on my school years at all. I spent the next 25 years in a whole variety of jobs, none even remotely related to academia or education. It was the world of hard knocks, if you like. And I guess the change for me was at the age of 40, my father, and I've got an image up in the background of my grandfather, a very prominent early Aboriginal activist, pictured with his sister, and also the political organisation he formed, the first united all Aboriginal political organisation, the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, that formed in Sydney in 1924. And at the age of 40, my father said to me, he said, look, son, I was out of work at this particular point in time. I want you to put together the old man's history. I mean, he's not in any history of this country, but I want something for our family. I want you to pull together what he did and what he stood for, at that particular point in time. So there was no greater image of me getting a nice exercise book and writing up my grandfather's story with some letters that we had as a family and photographs and some newspaper cuttings, and researching more and gathering as much as I could, recording interviews with my father and my uncles and aunties and other people that knew my grandfather. And that was the image, the particular thing. I didn't see it going any further than that. But I visited Wallatuka, the Aboriginal Education Centre. The Murray Aboriginal woman, Tracy Bunder, who was then the director, I was kidnapped into doing a diploma course. So at the time I turned around, I was enrolled at university, which was completely blew me away. I did a 2-year diploma, I did a BA in 2 years, and then I did a PhD in under 3 years. And of course, since that point, I've written 12 books, and I'm a professor. I've spoken at Harvard. I've delivered lectures on board the QE2. But the whole driver was my grandfather and his organisation and what he stood for, which wasn't historically recognised. They set up the first national land rights agenda. That was part of their platform by demanding enough land for each and every Aboriginal family in the country. They wanted the state government's practice of tearing Aboriginal kids away from their families and institutionalising stopped. They wanted the Aborigines protection boards, the state government's protection boards, to be abolished and replaced by an all Aboriginal board to sit under the federal government. They wanted to protect a distinct Aboriginal cultural identity, including language and stories and knowledge. And they demanded self-determination. So that was the driver for me and where I am today. I mean, that's the inspiration that I took, and I certainly made up for lost time.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that story. Tembeka.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the only one on the panel who is a lawyer by training. I started off as a lawyer, primarily doing constitutional law, constitutional work, but in the area of restorative justice, which for the most part is future looking, but it became quite clear early on in my career that it was impossible in the South African context to think about the future without thinking about the past. And so I began to take the past seriously to undo, understand, and package my own sense of self. Of course, it is almost inevitable if you are Black and you live in South Africa and you grew up under apartheid, as I did, and not to engage with your reality. Two things stand out for me. The first one is the packaging of history. It was the idea that the Cape was really discovered by the Dutch and the British. They gave it the identity, the name, the complexion. And it was an empty piece of ground when they discovered it. At university, the same message was reinstated and repeated. But now it was given legitimacy through law. One of the courses I took was the law of property. One of the subjects in the law of property was precisely this question of the empty land thesis. It was called Terra Nullius. Terra Nullius essentially was this concept that when the Europeans arrived in Africa, for the most part, they found the land vacant. And the principle under Roman Dutch law was that if you occupied the land long enough, you acquired it by extinctive prescription after a period of 30 years. But there was always this conflict that at university and at school, you are told that when the Europeans arrived, the land was empty. But your grandmother tells you that they were here. and you never got the sense of the disjuncture between their lived experience and the books that you have to read. And so as a practicing lawyer, I began to ask these questions and to take the past seriously. And in the past, I would say 15, 20 years, I have been engaged in particularly questions of land, and that has driven me further and further into the past. And the past is a very exciting destination.
Indeed, indeed. You're speaking to historians, so we will not dispute that for sure. So, all of you, there's similarities and differences, in the work that all of you do. One of the similarities, of course, is that all of you are working at the intersection of law and history in different white settler colonial contexts. North America for Doug, Australia for John, and South Africa for Tembeka. And Tembeka did, and of course South Africa, as Tembeka and I have discussed, is not only a British settler colony, but it's also a Dutch settler colony. So it has that kind of like plural colonialism happening. Now, a common feature of settler colonialism all around the world is the desire for land ownership, right? What settler colonialism involves is sending one group of people to take possession of land, which inevitably requires the dispossession of those who are there. As Tembeka says, they said no people were there, but my grandmother told me something different. So, you know, to make land available for this possession by one group of people, which leads to the dispossession of others, you know, often involved uses of law. As you know, Tembeka has brought up this notion of Terra Nullius, and of course in the Native American context, we have other arguments that are made. So I'm wondering if each of you, just for our audience members who may be more or less familiar with each of your historical contexts, if you can just give us a little bit of historical context and maybe an example or two to help us understand how law enabled colonization and the dispossession of Native peoples. I'll let you pick your own order. Then I'm not. You know, I mean, we can keep going, but we can change it up a little bit. It's up to you.
I'll speak in response to Tembeka, you know, because there's a lot of continuities and overlaps. One important concept in North America is the doctrine of discovery, which is the doctrine of Christian discovery. You know, and prior to the sort of early formation of European notions of race, right? It's the language of Christian supremacy, right? And on the basis of Christian supremacy, right, this becomes the sort of colonial justification, right? And the doctrine of discovery is something that is baked into U.S. law through and through. It's something that, it is, it's based upon papal bulls of the, 14th and 15th century, right? And so it is medieval ideology about Christian superiority, right? And the innate inferiority and incapability, thus, of indigenous people to govern themselves, to make any sort of meaningful claim to land, right? Because of ideas that, sound like John Locke later about what it is to cultivate property and earn a right to it in that sense, right? But the doctrine of discovery is what establishes the very basis that the European colonizers have to their claims, right? And the United States regards itself as inheriting such claim from Britain. And one way, to give a quick example of how that idea is baked in and continues to be present, the doctrine of discovery is enshrined in U.S. law in a powerful way in 1823 with the decision Johnson v. McIntosh. And long story short, based on this stuff about Christian supremacy, comes to the conclusion that Piankashaw people in Illinois couldn't possibly have title to give and to transfer in the first place because we don't have the right of title. So the idea is indigenous people have the right of occupancy, but not of title, right? And that becomes the basis of U.S. property law, right? Indigenous people don't have a claim to it. So even if one is to acquire title directly from Native people, no, it doesn't count. Native people don't even have the capacity to have title, right? And that's in 1823. And again, it's an early formative idea. And to sort of follow the chain, this idea comes up again in 2005, Johnson v. McIntosh, in a case in upstate New York about Oneida Nation of New York, which is a relative nation in our homelands in New York, and the potential for buyback and how that was going to play out. And maybe we can get into the details maybe later. But the long story short is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg raises Johnson v. McIntosh as valid precedent for making the claim that the Oneida Nation of New York can't simply, the question is, start buying back central New York and placing it back into sovereign status, right? The idea being, well, if you won't come to our settlement, we'll just start buying back New York ourselves then. The Supreme Court says, whoa, you can't just start buying it back. It's not going to work that way. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg turns to Johnson v. McIntosh as the basis for saying, no, there's a limit, there's a wall.
I suppose, I do want to come in here. I wonder, Liz, if I may. There were two great ideas that informed a British settlement. I'm talking now about 19th century settlement of South Africa by the British. One big man was Sir George Grey, who arrives in 1854 as the governor of the Cape. And he comes here having come from Australia, New Zealand. In fact, he had earned his knighthood as the writer of the New Zealand Constitution, which essentially placed that entire land under the British control. As an elevation, he obtained his knighthood and a promotion to be the governor of the Cape. His vision is set out in his first address to the Cape Parliament, that he wants the native people, right, to aspire to be British. In other words, they wanted to create Black Englishmen out of the native people of South Africa. Right? The language that he employed was the language of civilization. And by civilization, he meant Christianity, language, education, public works. And so he then set up the process of converting the native people from their barbarous state into the civilized state. Law was then an essential element in the civilizing mission. They set up schools, they set up churches, they set up instrument of domination and punishment, and they set up the courts. And if one goes through those early judgments of the colonial courts, those early judgments of the courts of slavery, what you find without any mistake is the imposition of external rule and the total dislocation of native systems of government. Much later, when it comes to land in particular, the doctrine, and that's why I was very fascinated to listen to what Doug was saying, the doctrine that was applied was that native law, or whatever they recognized to be native law, did not have embedded within it a concept of ownership, right? But they got into the idea of denying the concept of ownership by distorting the nature of the ownership. They decided that because native law did not recognize individual absolute title, therefore, it did not recognize ownership at all. Native law recognized communal forms of tenure, communal forms of joint ownership, so that in a family, there is no individual that owns a piece of ground to the total exclusion of the other. But early decisions, there was a decision in 1875 in this country, another decision in 1923, another decision in 1929, all of them affirming the European conception of native law as essentially laws that do not recognize ownership at all. It was on this basis of the derecognition of native law's conception of ownership that the Europeans could justify their hold over native land. So because the land cannot be held in individual title, it is therefore ownerless. And as ownerless, it could be acquired by the British. They obviously drew from their two main theorists, one of whom was John Locke, right? And everyone knows John Locke's own history and background, right? Another one was Hugo de Groot, or Hugo Grotius. But both of these were no more than theorists of empire.
Yeah, I'll come in there and just go back, taking back to Tembeka's opening comment about Terra Nullius, which is exactly the same thing in Australia, a land they put down as belonging to no one, despite the fact that Western science now recognises Aboriginal people as being 65,000 years as a part of the continent. But from an Aboriginal perspective, we've been here since the time before time began. So, and the impact of that Terra Nullius was invasion, occupation, dispossession, cultural destruction, assimilation, segregation. I could just go on and on and on as far as that history is concerned. But as far as an example, a historical example, if you like, you can take it all the way back to James Cook. I mean, going to Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus, but he was given secret instructions by the Admiralty as such from the Crown, that after that he was to go in search of the Great Southern Land. And if finding it, he was to map its coast and open up, if there were native people there, to open up dialogue and discussion and gain consent to attain a couple of trading posts there. We know that Cook sailed up the entire east coast of Australia. He did touch down in Botany Bay, and I mean, in that first moment when Cook came ashore with Solander and Banks' other crew members, 2 Aboriginal men came down onto that beach brandishing spears and made it quite clear and very loud that they were not welcome. There was no red carpet rolled out. And Cook was the man who had the musket. And he initially fired a shot over the 2 Aboriginal men's head as a warning. The response from the 2 Aboriginal men was to send a fusillade of spears into the sand around their feet. Cook then fired a small shot into their legs. And the young boy, the young youth, he ran back into the bush, but the senior Aboriginal man stayed and threw more spears, at which point Cook fired another gun which wounded the older Aboriginal man. So this is the opening of that sort of contact. And Cook, even in his log, marks down, and as I said, he was supposed to gain consent and open up discussion. He clearly says himself, all they seemed to want from us was to be gone. Now, he then sailed up the entire east coast to what they call Possession Island, jammed down a flag and claimed the entire east coast of Australia for the Crown, which was in violation of the orders he'd been given because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. So in that sense, he broke the law.
I mean, this is so interesting. I know I'm not on the panel, but as a moderator and as a historian of law, I will say, you know, I'm a historian of India. India was never contemplated as a settler colony for many reasons, one of which is the British recognize a complex agrarian system that already exists. So to Tembeka's point, the British actually, the Indians have layered ideas of land holding, not land ownership, called zamindari. And the British introduced private property into Bengal in India. So far from not, you know, they actually bring private property into Bengal in order to regularize tax collection. So I think there are interesting differences in terms of land and how land law and colonialism operate in terms of settler colonialism versus non-settler colonialism. But that's a whole other, we could talk a long time about that as well, sort of comparative questions. So I want to just talk about, so I think for many of people listening today, it may come as a surprise, right? People tend to associate law with justice. And anybody who studies the history of colonialism immediately has to sort of disaggregate law and justice. Law does not serve justice by any means. So, you know, we've been talking so far about how law enables colonialism and, you know, and so I want to talk a little bit about how law enables resistance to colonialism as well. And this is a big debate, of course, because some might say that, you know, since law plays a central role in the dispossession of Native people, maybe it would be better for Native people, as John mentioned, to get some spears and just throw them back at the colonizers rather than go through their avenues, go through their court systems. But on the other hand, many people have argued that law did and still does remain an important weapon of anti-colonial resistance and a central ally in the fight for freedom and land repatriation. In fact, as Tembeka writes in his book, he writes, quote, I will quote you, "The unfinished struggle for land can only take place through a framework of law." Powerful statement there. Doug has worked as an expert witness in legal cases. So obviously, I'm curious to hear, Doug, what you think about that. So I'm wondering, you know, in this ongoing struggle for decolonization, right? We look at decolonization as a process, not a moment, right? So even though, so it's in this ongoing effort to decolonize land, you know, do you think that, what role does law play? Is law part of the problem? Is law part of the solution? And might you give us an example or two to think about how legal tactics and strategies have served or not served Indigenous communities in the fight for land rights and freedom? And if you, I think we know Tembeka's view about this, but if you think that law has not served, and again, I quoted her last week, but she's one of my favorite poets, so I'll quote her again. The great American poet Audre Lorde says, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. I'm paraphrasing. So if law built the master's house, can it dismantle the master's house? Or does it maintain the master's house? No, it cannot. Okay, so I'm curious, what other tools are available to those seeking land, justice, and freedom?
Yeah. Well, from an Indigenous perspective, it's all about injustice. That's the reality of our experience. And look, we've been dudded by law, you know, all the way through. I mean, at the moment, certainly in Australia, where you think of the legal fight and things being changed for the good. Back in the 80s in New South Wales, we had the establishment of the New South Wales Land Rights Act, which gave Aboriginal people in New South Wales the opportunity of regaining, you know, certain portions of Crown land for the differing groups across the state. But the reality is, back at that point, the Rand Labor government was informed, and I want to go back in a historical period, back to the period of my grandfather, which was one of the fights they were fighting for. From the 1850s through to the early decades of the 20th century, it's a great period of history that Australia, and many people are not aware of, Aboriginal people were writing petitions, and I'm talking about New South Wales here. Some people had gained a degree of education, or they'd been assisted by non-Indigenous people to write petitions to the government to regain land in their own traditional country. You know, 30, 40 acres, even up to 500 acres. And in most instances, this was given. I mean, there was no, how can you say, heavily controlled reserve or mission like came later from the 1930s, where everyone was thrown onto worthless land and penned off. These were independent farms. And it was the police who went out and looked at the land that these Aboriginal people were asking for. And these letters are in the archives. It's heavily timbered, worthless scrub. Give it to them. Now, within 2 years, the letters are coming back from the police officer saying the land's all been cleared, it's been fenced, it's been cropped, they've built homesteads, they've got livestock. But there was a marriage here of traditional lifestyle. Aboriginal people were still speaking language. They were connected to their own country. No one knew the seasons or the land better, and they prospered. And there's all these records of Aboriginal people clearing 100, 200, 300 pounds annually with their maize crops. That one family had bought themselves a piano. They were doing extremely well. They were winning blue ribbons in the agricultural shows. But from 1910 through to 1930, the Protection Board came in and started to rip all that land back away because of white interest and white demands for that land. There was also the soldier resettlement scheme for soldiers coming back from the First World War. They were handing the land that Aboriginal people had worked on for 50 years to these returning soldiers. No compensation. Aboriginal people were thrown off at the point of a gun. Now, in 1983, with the passing of the Land Rights Act in New South Wales, the Rand Labor government became aware that all those revocations were in fact illegal. And to cover their arse, so to speak, with the passing of the Land Rights Act, and it came back on us because we did not know this history. We'd been disconnected from this history ourselves. It wasn't until later we realised what had happened. We signed off on that. And that's how law dudded us, because it was billions of dollars of money for that land, which is all prime coastal and north coast land. That Aboriginal people were dudded for. So, and that continues on through native title. I mean, from the Mabo Act. And I mean, the reality is there's only a small percentage, 2% of the Aboriginal population who can actually regain land. You've got to demonstrate that you have been carrying on cultural connection with that land all the way through. And you can show genealogical and evidence and anthropological evidence. There's only 2% of the Aboriginal population can meet those legal determinants. So
I don't know that everyone would be familiar with that Mabo decision. You want to explain that just briefly?
Yeah, that came back through Eddie Mabo, Torres Strait Islander, who had a long fight with the government because, I mean, as we go back to a land belonging to no one and the whole concept that Indigenous people had no connection to the land, Eddie Mabo was able to demonstrate that Torres Strait Islanders were farming the land and they had crops, and he won that decision. He said he didn't see the decision won. He died before that, but that impacted right across the Australian continent then and changed, and with native title was a result of that. But again, that's a very watered down version of what Aboriginal people see as, genuine land rights.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Who wants to jump in? Doug, you seem to have a strong response.
Yes, in terms of not dismantling the master's house, certainly. And I think it's important to be aware that all times we're, as Indigenous people trying to maneuver these systems, just trying to find a way to get up from underneath it. Right? I mean, there's a lot of, is law the problem, or is it part of the solution? And in so many ways, I just think it's a thing that's there, in a sense that, I want to say, this isn't law's fault, colonialism, don't blame law. Law didn't do these things. It's European ideas about supremacy that did these things, right? And the reason I say that and emphasize that is because Haudenosaunee people, the Six Nations Confederacy in North America, we long have had our own law, the Great Law of Peace, which formed our confederacy. The United States was not the first republic, even on the continent, right? So law is present in a variety of ways, right? I mean, it's all a thicket of legalities and economic ties as well. But in so many ways, it makes me think, whose law? I mean, I think that's one of the that's one of the biggest dilemmas, and in terms of coming to recognize that there are important incompatibilities in philosophies that ought to be addressed, right, between legal systems, right? And that's to say that we have philosophies that come from entirely different intellectual histories that are worthy of inclusion and recognition in a deep and sustained way in terms of how they can help contribute to the fabric of in the case of North America, American democracy. And that is present, to an extent. But one thing, I give it as an example of that in terms of fundamentally different philosophies. I mean, the Western Hemisphere is not rooted in a tradition that, for instance, sees humanity as superior to other creatures on the planet, right? Understands human beings in relationship to the rest of the world, and not in a subdue the earth and conquer it sort of way, right? Of human supremacy. And I think the movement toward things like the rights of nature, right, which has gained traction in New Zealand, are indicative of that, of completely different philosophies, right? And it's not just these questions about how do we make this system more fair. Certainly, yes, that's a concern, but the way to do that, it's not just about making little adjustments. There's massive rethinking that needs to happen.
Tembeka, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I mean, I think everyone knows E.P. Thompson, right? Who wrote Whigs and Hunters, The Origin of the Black Act. He spent all the first 10 chapters explaining what was wrong with the British legal system and how it served to marginalize the working class and the peasant class in England. And in the last chapter, which was quite controversial by Marxist historians, he spent defending the rule of law as an unqualified human good. And so it is a reflection of the paradox that we always face. That on the one hand, we have a legal system imposed from the top by the British. And it came to us as violence. When I mean us, it came to native people as violence. What they saw as law were policemen and in bayonets and in guns. That was law. That is what they saw. But the compassionate side of law is something they have had to discover themselves. The paradox in all of this is that the ideas of justice, which we now claim should infuse the legal system, were not ideas introduced by the British to African people. These were ideas that were innate within African communities. These were ideas that they themselves originate. These are not ideas that are imposed from the top. The British were never interested in justice. What they wanted was to pillage and to plunder the natural, the human resources of the country. It was the native people themselves, as an instrument of revolution, who began thinking about notions of equality, notions of rights, notions of justice, etc. But the paradox is that much later, that struggle, long struggle for freedom, that pretty much begins the moment the first settler gets off the boat, is then appropriated by the British themselves. And they present it as if it is a gift that comes from Europe. And so even this idea of law, we in many respects, we tend to appropriate. I mean, the British tend to appropriate this. The white settlers tend to appropriate the idea as a gift to Africans. So the first thing is a question of paradigm. I mean, from whose perspective you are talking about justice? Because if you were in South Africa in 1910 and you stood out and you said, I want equality for all, they literally would have cut your head off. In fact, Nelson Mandela did precisely the same thing. They sent him to prison for 27 years. But it's Nelson Mandela's innate sense of justice that animates what we call today the law. So at the heart of the law today, as we understand it, because the law is also not a static thing, at the heart of the law as we know it today is actually restoration. But that is contested as well, because notions of restoration are complex notions. African people themselves are contesting among African people, right? Who settled first where? Tribal questions are extremely difficult tribal questions, right? And to resolve those questions, internal, intra-tribal questions, to resolve those questions, they have to resort to some sort of a legal, so it's not a legal system. So it's not always a contest between the Eurocentrism and African notions of law, but it is also a contest within African societies. And so questions about, you know, who was here first? Were we here before the were the San people here first? Those are extremely difficult questions. Navigating them necessarily must resort to a legal system of some sort. So even where we want to decolonize, I mean, that's the language that we use, and one supports the language of decolonization and the general movement of decolonization, one always gets the sense that the paradigm is yet to be settled. The paradigm of decolonization is itself yet to be settled. Today, five of us are speaking in English. But we shouldn't. Why don't we speak in Xhosa or in any of the Australian indigenous languages? This itself is part and parcel of the language of conquest, right? Which the law is written in that language of conquest. Thank you. Sorry.
I just want to certainly support what Tembeka said there as well. And as part of native title in Australia, what it has resulted with is we as Aboriginal people spend most of our time fighting amongst ourselves now. The infighting, the differences of opinion of whose land it is. I mean, it's just, a shambles. And I mean, and that suits governments. While we're tearing apart at each other at the ground level, they're happy to say, look what they're doing. They can't even resolve an issue. But the whole thing about native title is pulling us apart. I mean, so it's ripping and tearing, and as I said, we're just pulling ourselves apart. in regards to that. So it's doing its job to keep us from being a pan-Aboriginal movement to be completely, at odds with one another.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's always a challenge with decolonizing movement, is that question of origins, right? Who are the original inhabitants, right? What is so what do you go back to? I mean, it's famous, like in the Indian case, Gandhi, who for some is a hero, other not so much, he wrote this famous book, Hind Swaraj, where he says, Indians should go back to the village way of life. And one of his most powerful interlocutors, who was an untouchable and Dalit activist named B.R. Ambedkar, who wrote the Indian Constitution, who studied law at Columbia and LSE, he says, the village is a site of caste oppression. It's a site of horrors. That's the last place we as Dalits want to go back to, the site where we are going to be kind of ground down under the foot of the Brahmins. So that question of what do we go back to is a complex one across, decolonizing societies. I want to pick up on the question of violence. I thought it was interesting, Tembeka, how you said law comes as violence, and John, you gave us the image of the Aboriginal man, that famous incident of where Cook shoots a musket and does he? I don't think he kills.
Well, we don't know the result of that. It was how badly wounded does the man die because he went back into the bush? We don't know, and the youth was shot in the legs. So we're not to know the result of that, but quite possibly that man died. Yeah. So that's the level of violence. I mean, for us, I mean, invasion, I mean, on the frontier, so to speak, I mean, it's recorded by in the 1980s. There was an environmental historical study done by Noel Butland, and he estimated that only 6 decades after the British got to the Australian continent, that up to between 60 to 90% of the Aboriginal population right across the continent was gone, either through violence or disease and the impact of smallpox. Now, you can imagine today in a country, if your population was reduced by somewhere to 60 to 90%, you're looking at someone dropping the atomic bomb, or multiple numbers of atomic bombs. And that was the impact of that onto us. Before I finish, I mean, in regards to that, I'd just like to read out a letter my grandfather wrote to the New South Wales state government in 1927. And I think really clearly identifies that because of the continued dismissal of state governments of the shocking conditions that Aboriginal people were being subjected to. And he said, I wish to make it perfectly clear on behalf of our people that we should inferior head with the European people. Two distinct civilizations are represented by the respective race. That the of war destroyed our more ancient civilization is freely admitted, and that by their vices and diseases our people have been decimated is also patent. But neither of these facts are evidence of superiority. Quite the contrary is the case. The members of the AAPA, his organisation, have also noted the strenuous efforts of the trade union leaders to attain the conditions which existed in our country at the time of invasion by Europeans. The men only work when necessary. We called no man master, and we had no king. And that letter was written in 1927. It was a very powerful letter in response to the dismissal of governments of Aboriginal people at that particular point in time. But it covers most of those main points, certainly invasion and violence, and that impacted onto us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in this question of law and violence. I know a lot of the recent work on Australia. I mean, when people do comparative work, they often note that, a big difference in Australia is no treaties, right? This is Terra Nullius. We don't recognize Native people as having any sovereignty or rights to the land, and therefore there's no need to buy land from them or make treaties. And then some people have linked this to this, century and a half long frontier wars that led to the death of tens of thousands on top of the 750,000 or so that are estimated to have died from disease and right. So, in that way, perhaps I guess there could be an argument made that lack of law led to violence, right? Nothing restrained these settlers. There was no tribunal to which an Aboriginal person could, right? There wasn't tribunals. So I don't know, but I'm wondering, you know, given the case, I mean, I believe in North America, Doug, and correct me if I'm wrong, the number is 97 or 98% of Indigenous people died. So even higher numbers possibly than Australia. I don't actually know much about that kind of questions of that kind of question. I don't know where I mean, my understanding in South Africa is there's this whole reversal of the language of genocide where you have people like Simon Roche talking about white genocide, and there's this whole inversion of that white people are now suffering injustice and genocide. I don't know, but yeah, I know. Right? It's kind of comical. But anyway, I'm wondering what you think about that question about law and violence. You know, going back, was colonial law a restraining factor? Did it enable violence? Did it protect people? What your thoughts are about that role of law in restraining and or enabling colonial violence?
I don't think it stopped them, certainly not in Australia. They just ignored that. I mean, and the vigilante groups that went out, I mean, it just ran rampant across the country, and they were doing as they pleased. So there's a law for one and a law for another.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking, you know, one example of, I think the answer, you know, here is that it does both, right? I mean, at moments it can, it constrains violence, and at other moments it facilitates it. I mean, ultimately, I think the important point to get from that is that it's flexible and dependent upon what the imperial goal is at hand, right? I mean, the United States is born in a moment in which those kinds of questions are really quite clear. The proclamation line of 1763 is in so many ways an effort to curtail violence, right? It is an effort to put an end to costly, in a variety of ways, imperial wars, right, between competing European empires. And the proclamation line becomes, you know, a mechanism, becomes one of the first times that there's a clear dividing line between native and non-native, right, in the U.S. in terms of, you know, drawing one of these lines. Later, it'll be the Mississippi River. But the effort to establish that proclamation line is about Americans cannot settle west past that line, which is effectively the Appalachians. Don't go into that territory. We have negotiated. We are supposed to stay out. We're over here on the other side of that line. We've negotiated this. If you go over there, you're going to disrupt what are complicated negotiations and delicate relationships, right, that have centuries worth of, history and, and context and, ever changing along the way, right? These things are incredibly delicate, right? And easily can erupt into, continental scale, global scale conflict, right? And that's what the United States' independence is in so many ways about. We want to go west. We want to settle that land. It looks valuable. How dare you tell us to just sit here and not go over there and colonize such land? That's, so I mean, it's, that's one example of the ways in which, they're doing both. And in terms of, law facilitating, I mean, just very quickly, I won't go into detail, but I mean, the ways in which, in California and Texas, it becomes literal bounty on Native people's heads, right? Mm-hmm. And real ignorance of, choosing to look the other way and do nothing to, penalize the murder of Native people, right? But I mean, it's something that is, part of the state building project for sure, and actively supported. Mm-hmm. Way to make money in early California.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think on this topic about, the impact of the colonial laws, I mean, it certainly for the most part of British Africa, the settlers that were here, I mean, were essentially allowed to do as they pleased. I mean, if you look at someone like Harry Smith, basically the man was a thug. I mean, he's written his own book, his long autobiography is basically a confession to crimes against humanity. If we had the language today of crimes against humanity, Harry Smith would have gone to the International Criminal Court. He would have probably been hanged. So in the last war that he fought, so-called war that he fought against the Xhosa, so they murdered 16,000 of them in a couple of months. the punishment is that he must go back to England. He will be redeployed elsewhere. I think eventually he went to India or something. So that's the so-called and the punishment is not that he killed thousands of indigenous people. The offense is that he overspent on his budget for war. He spent £3 million more than he should have spent. And so they got very upset about this, and then they recall him. And they send someone who is even worse than him, to replace him. So the kind of punishments that they were assigning among themselves were certainly totally ineffective. In fact, if anything, they enabled violence. And then you look at someone else, actually, who is probably even a bigger thug, Cecil John Rhodes. Cecil John Rhodes is explicit about his disdain for native people. What happens? He actually gets a reward from Queen Victoria when he gets the Royal Charter of England. And the Royal Charter enables him to go north to Zimbabwe, essentially to take his company, British South African Company, to run the land of the indigenous Zimbabwean people as if it was his own personal fiefdom, a country that is owned by a company. But he gets explicit authority from Queen Victoria. So if on a scale, British colonial law certainly enabled and facilitated violence. They knew that people were being murdered. They took no steps to stop the murder. They were sending soldiers. They were sending money. They were sending food. In return, particularly during the era of Cecil John Rhodes, they were getting remittances. The empire was benefiting financially from its settlement. So this was a massively lucrative investment as well. And one must not forget that. This was, it was a lucrative investment, the investment on land, and it was the investment later on minerals, the so-called discovery of diamond. Remember, at some point, the De Beers Consolidated Company, which was a company owned by Cecil John Rhodes and Bani Banato, controlled something like 92% of the entire world's mineral resources. Look at the Goldfields Consolidated, which was the company that was also owned by Cecil John Rhodes. It became a strategically important investment, and which is why they were quite prepared to continue financing him in his endeavors in the North. So the law, in a sense, was manipulated, but it enabled conquest. And that was also largely because it made commercial sense from the British point of view.
Yeah. Okay.
Totally agree.
Yeah. This brings us to kind of my last question before we open it up, which is kind of bringing us to the present moment. I think that Cecil Rhodes is perhaps finally facing some reckoning. He's falling in Oxford. He fell in Cape Town, right? And Rhodes Must Fall movement, as we finally have some traction. And here we are. We're weeks away from this crucial U.S.-American presidential election. 80 years ago, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, quite a different president, I should add, as he was seeking his third term in the fall of 1940, William Faulkner, the novelist, wrote in Harper's Magazine that, quote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And these words animate my teaching, and they animate my work as a scholar and as a historian, and they're what make me love being a historian. And I just feel like in 2020, 80 years later, these words are really resonating with us, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, the Rhodes Must Fall movement, the internationalization of Black Lives Matter. People around the world are reckoning with these histories, these present histories, these pasts that are not past, of racial violence and oppression and injustice. And truth-telling about history has taken on an added urgency. Now, I know many of you, John, you're talking about decades. I've been involved in these kind of projects of what I would call, restorative history, truth-telling about history, revealing missing chapters, right? Unsilencing the silences in the past, exposing historical erasures, and really challenging this politics of forgetting. So I'm just wondering, my last question is a historical question of how is this project of restorative history linked to the project of restorative justice? How is the project of reclaiming land related to the project of reclaiming history, right? How does history matter in the work that you're doing?
I'll quickly jump in then. Look, it's all connected to land. Certainly from an Indigenous perspective, the whole thing is connected to land. And I would just say the whole restorative history project, if you like, as Brother Malcolm X said, if you have no past, you have no future. And that is the driver for us. I mean, I've been driven with the sense, I said earlier, I come through a school system where we were written out of it. We were not only erased from the historical page, but erased from the landscape. And it's partly driven to write us back in to that landscape, and particularly for our young people coming through, to know that they had heroes and heroines, across the past 230 odd years who fought against colonialism and continue to fight to this very day for Aboriginal rights to land and for our people. So that is the driver for me. And as I said, coming into academia so late, I've never written for the academy. You don't see my stuff sitting on bookshelves gathering dust. I write for our people to be able to read it, enjoy it, and gain inspiration from it. That's the driver for me. And also educate wider Australia what happened in this country since 1788. They're the drivers for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly significant. I mean, I absolutely agree with what John is saying, particularly about writing for the common man. Unfortunately, we still write in English.
You could be like Googie.
Yeah, we should start by decolonizing the language of writing. But I think that in this country, it's particularly significant because we have become so consumed with legacies of apartheid, which are immediate and urgent. But in doing so, we have actually forgotten the much larger story of the settlement of the Dutch, the settlement of the Portuguese, and the longer trajectory of longer and, I would say, uninterrupted trajectory of the settlement of the British, which in many ways created the perfect conditions for apartheid. They created the conditions for racial segregation. The first racial segregation laws were actually passed by the British. They created the conditions for the exploitation of labor. They didn't introduce slavery, but they perfected it. They introduced the perfect conditions for the exploitation of the minerals. All of the key elements of the apartheid legal order were borrowed from the British colonial system. So looking back at the past enables us, gives us the language to try and confront the present. But I do want to say something else, Liz, about this idea of going back, and the debate we had earlier about, whose land is this actually, who was here first. For the most part, that is a necessary inquiry to be undertaken. And the question is again one of paradigm. It is, what are you trying to achieve? Because if the point is to illuminate hidden parts of the past, then of course that is a positive inquiry. But if the point is about opening up new ethnic cleavages, then of course that takes a totally different dimension. So it seems to me to be always never a question of whether you go back or you don't go back, but you must always go back. But you must always understand that the object is about building a good constitution.
Yep.
Okay, Doug, and then we'll open it up to our patient audience.
Thinking about restorative histories, there's just so much here, and we'll continue to chat, I'm sure. I think of a few things come to mind, and one is, we were talking about accessible text. I just wanted to recommend one that I think is really particularly great in terms of its approach to language, and that is Noe Silva's Aloha Betrayed, which is written in English, but what I like that it does is there are large untranslated sections that sometimes go on for pages at a time. And if you're not somebody who is familiar with the Karakamali language, You just have to work around it, and you have to, you have to go to the glossary and you have to look things up. It makes you do extra work, and in the sense that that John's talking about. I mean, it's written for community, right? And so it really truly is. You can tell by looking at how the book is organized that it truly is. There's something interesting too about an intervention of its own, right? Which is the book makes you learn a Hawaiian language in so many ways, right? It forces you to, because it doesn't just give you the translation, forces you to go back and reread, But thinking about the presence of, the past and our present, I mean, for instance, every day in Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, so much of what drives our politics and ongoing challenges are about things that happened in the late 19th century. In a very direct way, not in a distant, disconnected sort of way either at all. It's every day the dilemmas of land that stem from a policy passed in 1887 and implemented in Wisconsin in 1893. So much of our challenges every day are about that reality, which is always present with us. But at the same time, I think the work of doing Indigenous history too it's important that we allow ourselves to have history, right? And by what I mean by that is, to have space to turn into our own internal dynamics, our own conversations and arguments and disagreements, and the possibilities of restorative history, right? As you put it, I think part of that is allowing us to have a full and complicated history. And for me, what that's included is sharing uncomfortable stories about about community members, right? Really fleshing out unpopular perspectives that were very pro-assimilationist in their own moment, right? And trying to be historically sensitive with them and not simply presume that these people were dupes in the past, right? But to have some respect for they were thoughtfully trying to figure out how to navigate out of what was a life or death situation, right? And I think having a sense of us fighting in the middle of this process along the way is more realistic to what these processes actually look like. And I think it's important for us to have a sense of our history inside that struggle, not just the external history, right? To the outside actor.
Well put.
Yeah, beautifully put. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes. We have some questions in the Q&A. Can those of you on my panel, can you see the questions in the Q&A?
Yes, we can.
So I don't know if you want to just have a look and see what strikes your fancy, or you want me to field them?
No, I can start with the specific one about the role of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Okay.
If no one else wants to go first. I mean, I personally think that is an absolutely wonderful question. The question is, will an institution like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission probably be better in resolving struggles around deprivation of land? I mean, I think it's excellent because it is one of the things I've written about, that if you draw a distinction between the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was really intended to address the so-called gross human rights violations, but within its terms of reference, it excluded land. And you draw that comparison with the land reform process. One of the unanswered questions for many Indigenous people in this country who were deprived of land is that they never got a chance to confront their dispossessors or their violators in the same way as it happened in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Whether they lied or they didn't lie, because many people believe that most people who went to the TRC lied, but it doesn't matter. They had a chance. They could put a face to the injustice. They could confront them. They could insult them. They could shout at them. They could scream. They could cry, whatever. But they put a face to their suffering, historical suffering. But with the land reform process, that didn't happen. Instead, they were channeled through a bureaucratic process. They were told to go to the Department of Land Affairs. Then they were told the officials were investigating the claim. Then they were told the officials wanted document X. then a historian came, then a lawyer came. Years and years and years went by. It is now 20 years later. So one of the elements of the land restoration story is the emotional connection to the land and the unearthing and the telling of that story, which on its own is crucial in the process of restoration. And one of the reasons why this is such an important question is because it connects the intangible with the tangible. Because the dispossession of land was not just the taking of the asset, but it was also the deculturation of people. It was the denial of humanity. And it is impossible to think of its restoration without thinking about the intangible and the non-material aspects to it. And that is what I think perhaps the Truth and Reconciliation Commission could have served the function of facilitating as a platform to confront your violators, which didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
I'll make a comment. I think it's Paul Rosier. What strategies have Indigenous activists used to gain attention in public discourse to generate support for their campaigns? I think this is an important one, certainly from oppressed or Indigenous people, right across the 20th century and through to today, is the use of the media and using strategic ways of getting our messages across. And again, I go back to my grandfather in saying in the press at the time, we need to get the message to wider Australia of what is happening here. And it happened through the 60s as well. Charles Perkins emulated Dr. Martin Luther King's freedom rides. And there were television cameras then going across New South Wales, which showed the shocking third world conditions that Aboriginal people were being subjected to, living next to garbage tips or the sewerage outlets in tin shanties in New South Wales of the 1960s. And Perkins, with a bunch of university students, used the media and television to bring that event into people's lounge rooms and embarrass Australian governments. There's the same thing with the 1972 Tent Embassy set up on the lawns of Parliament House in Canberra in 1972 on, the Aboriginal access to land, a genuine Aboriginal land rights. But it was getting that message across. And the Tent Embassy did it on an international scale. I mean, that message of Aboriginal activists sitting up on the lawns of Parliament House went global. And it is using this medium. And of course, now we've got social media as well. You look at the pipeline at Standing Rock, and the international attention that was gained through that was global. So these are the things how we need to go and use, and we have done it in the past, and we need to continue to do it in the future.
Okay, we have a series of kind of interrelated questions. I don't know, perhaps Doug, you want to address those. Whitney Martinko says, well, I don't have to read for you, do I? Can everybody see the questions? I don't know what everybody else sees. So Whitney says, it strikes me that we're talking about law as colonial law. Could our guest speak to the history of Indigenous law? Does decolonization ever emerge from histories of Indigenous law and law courts? And connected to that is a question about how Indigenous law is used strategically, I'm assuming, to serve colonial purposes. And then there's another connected question here, which is, how have legal frameworks been mobilized to what some Native scholars on Turtle Island refer to as bleed out Native nations? Conversely, how have Indigenous communities mobilized their own notions of legal citizenship to advance their own sovereignty? I think that's like a cluster of interesting interconnected questions.
Jump in with them.
Anyone want to take that on?
In terms of talking about Indigenous law, that's to get back to a point I was making earlier. That's let's not blame law for things that are actually driven by ideologies of colonialism and racism. Thinking about the importance of Indigenous law as something that offers potential pathways toward some sort of community rebuilding and and healing, in the sense of, we have our own important legal histories, right? As I mentioned before, the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy, right? We have our own history that that a period of immense violence in northeastern North America comes to an end through the spread of a new law that links together these initially 5 nations that are brought together through a clan system and matriarchal leadership, and are organized in such a way that each of these nations are independent but also connected to one another, right? And these are all our own laws, right? And they're complicated, and they're recited as oral tradition. They're what hold the community together. And they also reflect, as I was getting at before, thinking about the ways in which important cultural logics are sometimes buried in things like the law. I think it's important to recognize that that's the value of Indigenous law. That's the value of creating space for Native communities to create their own justice systems, right? And their own model, which it comes in a variety of forms, right? I'm working with a student right now who's doing research on healing and wellness courts, right, that pursue alternative pathways toward dealing with problems of drug and alcohol abuse in Indian country, right? Effectively just allowing for that sort of community control, on the basis of their own philosophies.
I mean, Doug, I do want to just follow up on that. If I could just make one interjection. I mean, in this country, at least, the British did not just impose the British legal system on top, but they also distorted the nature of Indigenous law in ways that served the colonial project. And the way they did this is that they initially sent governors to basically run native lives. So you would have someone like Smith or someone like Gray or someone like Deben or someone like Cathcart, but these were colonial officials sent. But as colonialism morphed into a more imperialistic form of governance, the mode of governance also changed into an indirect form of government, where people were appointed from within. Mm-hmm. So traditional chiefs were appointed, but they had to distort the way in which the traditional chiefs related to communities by concentrating power at the top and granting them powers they never had, particularly over the control of land. And so suddenly, the land is controlled by a chief, when in a true traditional legal system, the land belongs to the community. It is managed in a custodial relationship or trusteeship relationship by the chief. But in the colonial version of customary law, or in the colonial version of Indigenous law, the land suddenly belongs to the chief. And the reason they had to do it is because they needed somebody to transact with. Mm-hmm. And those chiefs that they appointed then became instruments in conveying British wishes. So the reason I mention this is because when we talk Indigenous law, we always have to be careful that we are talking about the version of Indigenous law from below, and not the version of Indigenous law that has been constructed by the British. Because Indigenous law has suffered its own traumas under the colonial system, part of the decolonizing project is to rebuild it.
I can just go with Tembeka there. It's totally in agreement there. I mean, it's the same thing in Australia. The British came in because we didn't have chiefs or leaders in that sense. It was council. It was men and women were the leaders of what was an egalitarian society. The British selected an individual, a male, and he's the king. He's the king of the tribe, and he even got a breastplate because that's what they needed. This fellow is now the king. That caused problems and issues within our communities. I mean, because that was not how Aboriginal society structure was run. So it changed the dynamics completely. They needed that structure to fit with their own, their own ideals. Yeah.
I think it's important too to keep in mind that some of these transformations that we're talking about, often involve the flipping entirely gender systems and dynamics that are established within communities. When policies of allotment are passed in the U.S., the idea is that everyone across the board, one size fits all, is supposed to become a productive, self-sustaining farmer, right? And regardless of what your own tradition is, or where you live and how farmable it is, or whether in the case of communities in the Northern Plains, right, agriculture is a tradition of women, and suddenly the new order is men are to become farmers out in the fields, and so I mean it involves lots of reorderings of how societies are working. I mean, I think one really great example of that is the most high-profile eruption of conflict between Native and settlers in the U.S. We could point to Wounded Knee in 1973, and so much of what is happening in that conflict is and this is the height of the American Indian movement, and it's in its most prominent standoff, and it's an armed standoff that goes on for weeks and weeks. Excuse me.
Okay, well, maybe, I don't know where Doug is going to come back. It sounds like, from what I'm hearing Tembeka say, Doug, you back?
Yeah, sorry about that. I had a computer
glitch.
So the connect back to Tembeka is that so much of what that conflict is about at Wounded Knee, the American Indian movement, is what's called the Indian Reorganization Act, which was passed in 1934, which is about much of what Tembeka is talking about, completely reconstituting tribal governments in a way that is advantageous for the U.S. Right? And so what's happening in 1973 is there's a conflict between inside the tribal government. It is Lakota people against one another in that sense. There is the new reformed government has now established itself, right, which is disproportionately Christian, mixed race, English speaking, and by the 1970s have antagonistic relationships with the traditional government, right? I mean, so these what are called IRA governments are imposed, and in some cases it's a relative success, but in many cases they set up a long ongoing conflict of this new illegitimate government, right, that the United States begins claiming is the official voice of the people, and a traditional government that doesn't always recognize that. And so that's why the American Indian movement is called to Wounded Knee in 1973, to help resolve this internal dispute that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has implanted in tribal leadership, dangerous actors.
Sounds like, I mean, this is just another version of this decolonizing. There is no going back, right? Because what was has been reconstituted, reinvented. So there's going forward, right? And I just wanted that we have a last question, which is about how does Indigenous history provide a vision, a forward-going history, a forward-going vision. And the question is, what are some of the ways in which Indigenous histories can inform public global understandings of climate change? I think, Doug, you maybe touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if anyone wants to take that on a bit off track, but I think links to this idea of maybe we're not going to go back, but maybe there's a path forward through Indigenous visions, Indigenous philosophies, Indigenous worldviews.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment in that. I think that's the way to go. I mean, we're in a serious situation today: climate change, global warming, rising sea levels, catastrophic storms. Mother Earth is giving a message, a quite clear message here, and certainly Indigenous knowledge and stories from the past with rising sea levels and all of these catastrophic events can point to the future. And certainly from our perspective, we lived and kept the earth as it was on the very first day. That is something that's been lost. And we've touched on this about the plunder of colonialism, and certainly in the name of the dollar or the pound, wherever they've gone, is to, completely use and abuse the planet. Something drastic has to be done very quickly. And as I said, I think our stories and our knowledge can lend to that and show a path to a future that is different.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also, I come back to this question of a paradigm. You know, African societies looked at the world as a single integrated whole. They looked at life as a single integrated whole. They knew that the air is given to us to use and to pass on. In the same way as their conception of land, when you actually try and inquire into the indigenous ways of land holding, because land was not something that you could appropriate, you inherited it, you used it, but you left it for other generations. In the same way as you relate to water, the same way as you relate to the air, in the same way as you relate to animals. So it's this idea of looking at life as a single integrated whole. May not provide complete answers, but it is an antidote to the culture of consumerism, which is at the heart of climate change and global warming.
Absolutely. Doug, you want to weigh in?
So many of those same logics that that drive the problems of global climate change, right, are also tied, to issues of imperialism. I think one important point to keep in mind is, that Indigenous people have science, and it's just as valid as anybody else's science. Examples of what I mean, that Indigenous people in central Mexico invented corn, right? I say invented, cultivated, over thousands of generations, right, to create this plant that is now one of the plants that grows most easily around the planet, right? California is on fire lately because it is no longer, subject to a practice of controlled burns. I live in Chicago. This entire city once burned to the ground because of the same sort of problem, right? That there no longer were controlled burns in the prairie that ultimately led to the entire city burning to the ground. And so it's important to recognize, that traditional knowledge and oral tradition that are passed down, to really respect them as science, that to respect them as this is a single idea, a single piece of wisdom that has traveled its way for thousands of generations to reach us, that this is through experience, right? This is the way we should do things.
Yep.
And I think in so many ways in Indigenous communities, the approach is not to question that, right? And I think there are some cultural differences in that sense, but to appreciate is science.
Excellent. So on that note, I want to thank all of my co-panelists here who just provided such a fantastic evening of inquiry and conversation. And thank you to members of the audience who were here to join us. I want to remind you that we will be back next Wednesday at 12:30 with Dr. Martinko talking about sort of recapping and talking about what we've been the issues that have come up in the past couple of weeks. We hope you will stay with us next week. Next month, we're looking to decolonize the church. We're decolonizing everything this year. Okay, we're just getting started. Okay, we're just getting started. So stick with us. Okay, and everybody have a nice evening. Mask up, social distance, and if you're here in the USA, vote.